Here is a question that Western media will never ask, honestly. What does it mean when the most powerful military establishment on earth issues ultimatum after ultimatum to a nation, and that nation, without flinching, without trembling, simply ignores every single one of them? What does that tell you about the real balance of power? What does that reveal about who actually holds the strategic upper hand in this confrontation? Because right now, as of April 21st, 2026, Donald Trump has once again stepped before the cameras, issued what his administration is calling a final warning to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and demanded that Tehran send a delegation to Islamabad or face what he called inevitable military consequences. And Iran's answer, delivered not through panic, not through frantic back-channel pleading, but through a composed and resolute silence, was in essence, no, we are not coming. And if you want war, then prepare yourselves for what that war will actually cost you. This is not the story that CNN will tell you. This is not the narrative that the BBC will construct for its audiences. What you are about to hear is the unfiltered geopolitical reality of this moment. The actual military calculus, the real diplomatic breakdown, the full historical context of why Iran is standing exactly where it is standing, and why the United States, for all its aircraft carriers and all its threats, finds itself in a strategic position that grows weaker with every passing hour. Stay with me, because what unfolds over the next few minutes will completely reframe everything you think you know about this crisis. Let us begin with the most important fact that is being deliberately buried beneath an avalanche of Western propaganda. Iran is not afraid. This is not a slogan. This is not government bravado designed for domestic consumption. It is a strategic reality grounded in decades of preparation, decades of building military infrastructure, weapon systems, missile bases, underground naval facilities, and research and development centers that the American military campaign, for all its proclaimed precision and technological superiority, failed to destroy. During the 40-day war that the Western press breathlessly covered as an American and Israeli triumph, Iran was absorbing strikes while simultaneously revealing only a fraction of its capabilities. The majority of its missile bases were never opened. The majority of its underground naval installations were never engaged. Its key weapons, factories, and research centers buried deep beneath Iranian soil were untouched. And yet, as the world watched during the final 2 weeks of that war, Iran was not weakening. It was hitting harder. Every single week, the strikes from Iran grew more devastating, more precise, more consequential. And the American side, which had spent 40 days telling the world that Iran was running out of missiles, running out of drones, running out of options, that side was the one that blinked and accepted a ceasefire. But what comes next is even more revealing, because the ceasefire that was supposed to represent an opportunity for diplomacy has instead exposed the fundamental bad faith at the heart of American foreign policy in this region. The United States agreed to a ceasefire. Iran honored that ceasefire with discipline and restraint, holding back weapon systems it had deliberately kept in reserve precisely because it did not want unnecessary escalation. And what did Washington do in return? It imposed a maritime siege on Iranian ports in the Persian Gulf. It began seizing Iranian commercial vessels, civilian ships carrying civilian goods. It violated in the most brazen and public manner possible every commitment it had made. And then, with a level of audacity that truly staggers the analytical mind, it turned around and invited Iran to come back to the negotiating table, as if nothing had happened. As if the ink on the ceasefire agreement had not already been rendered meaningless by American unilateral action. As if Iran should simply ignore the blockade, ignore the seized ships, ignore the siege, and fly its delegation to Islamabad to smile for photographs and pretend that the United States is a credible negotiating partner. Iran's position is therefore not irrational. It is not extreme. It is the only logical response available to a sovereign nation that has been treated with this level of contempt. You cannot negotiate under siege. You cannot sign agreements with an entity that has already demonstrated in real time during an active ceasefire that it will not honor its commitments. The Iranian calculation is devastatingly simple. If America violated its obligations within days of a ceasefire, why would any agreement reached in Islamabad be worth the paper it is printed on? Why would Iran make concessions today that will simply be pocketed by Washington, which will then demand more concessions tomorrow while continuing to steal ships and blockade ports? The answer, of course, is that it would not. And so Iran is not going to Islamabad, not under these circumstances, not while the siege continues. And yet, and this is where the Western media narrative collapses entirely, Western news agencies are running breathless reports about unnamed Iranian sources suggesting that Tehran is wavering, reconsidering, preparing a delegation. These reports are fabrications. They are psychological warfare dressed in the language of journalism. Outlets like Iran International, which, let us be honest about what it is, a Mossad-aligned propaganda channel funded by interests aligned with the Israeli regime. These outlets exist precisely to manufacture the appearance of Iranian weakness, Iranian division, Iranian desperation, in order to give the Trump administration a pretext to say, you see, they want to negotiate. They are ready to capitulate. We just need to apply a little more pressure. It is a narrative manufactured for a specific political purpose, and anyone who has studied how American imperial management of information works will recognize the pattern immediately. Stay with me, because this is where the narrative completely changes, because we need to talk about what Trump actually said and what it reveals about the state of mind of the man who is supposedly conducting American foreign policy. Donald Trump told CNBC, and these are his own words, not a paraphrase, that he expects to be bombing Iran because, in his view, that is a better attitude to go in with. He said his military is raring to go. He spoke about signing a deal within days or hours. He claimed repeatedly that Iran had already agreed to concessions that Iran had never agreed to. He presented fictional frameworks as accomplished diplomatic facts. This is not the behavior of a statesman conducting serious geopolitical strategy. This is the behavior of someone operating without a coherent plan, saying whatever appears advantageous in the moment, regardless of whether it bears any relationship to reality. And the people around him, Witko, Vance, Kushner, this was the American team that sat across the table from Iran's delegation in Islamabad. Three men whose primary loyalty, it must be said plainly, is not to the strategic interests of the American Republic, but to a very specific ideological and political project centered on the preservation of the Israeli regime and the advancement of Zionist ambitions in the region. Vance himself was on the phone with Netanyahu during the negotiations. Netanyahu subsequently told the press that Vance had reported to him. Let that sink in for a moment. The Vice President of the United States was filing reports to a foreign prime minister during the course of diplomatic negotiations with a sovereign nation. If that does not tell you who is actually directing American foreign policy in this region, nothing will. The Iranian delegation, by contrast, arrived with full authority. Dr. Bagheri did not need to make a single phone call back to Tehran during the talks. He had the mandate, he had the framework, he was ready to negotiate seriously. The Americans were not. They walked away. And now they want Iran to come back for a second round while simultaneously blockading Iranian ports and seizing Iranian ships, while Trump publicly calls for the extermination of the Iranian nation and the destruction of Iranian civilization. And somehow, in the upside-down moral universe of Western media coverage, it is Iran that is cast as the unreasonable party. But it only gets worse from here because we need to confront something that goes far beyond the immediate diplomatic breakdown, something that the entire edifice of Western liberal commentary has conspicuously refused to address. When Donald Trump says on the record that he intends to take Iran back to the stone age, that he will obliterate the Iranian nation, that he will wipe out a civilization, these are not the words of a politician engaging in hyperbole for domestic audiences. These are statements that, if applied to any other context, would be immediately recognized as genocidal incitement. They are threats of collective punishment against an entire people, an entire civilization, an entire nation of 85 million human beings. And yet, search the pages of The Guardian, search the columns of the New York Times, search the broadcasts of CNN and the BBC. You will find no screaming headlines, no editorials demanding accountability, no framing of these statements as what they legally and morally are, incitement to crimes against humanity. The same outlets that claim to be the guardians of liberal democratic values, the same journalists who spent years lecturing the world about human rights and international law, have looked at Trump's explicit threats to exterminate an entire civilization and responded with a silence so complete, so deliberate, so revealing that it amounts to complicity. Piers Morgan was asked directly, repeatedly, 3 times, whether a regime founded upon ethno-supreism can be considered legitimate. He refused to answer 3 times. A man with a large global following, often presenting himself as a voice of moral clarity and geopolitical candor, was recently confronted with a question that cut to the core of a highly sensitive political issue. Yet instead of engaging it directly, he declined to state what some would consider an obvious moral or political characterization. His hesitation was interpreted by critics as revealing something broader than a single moment of avoidance. For them, it symbolized the informal boundaries that often shape discourse in Western media environments, boundaries that determine which interpretations are expressed openly and which remain carefully avoided. Whether one agrees with that assessment or not, the episode became a focal point for a wider argument about influence, narrative control, and the limits of acceptable speech in global political commentary. From there, the discussion expands into the consequences of a potential large-scale war involving Iran and the wider Persian Gulf region. In this framing, Gulf states such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain are not seen as passive observers, but as deeply embedded participants in the regional security architecture shaped by decades of American military presence. Their airspace access, logistical cooperation, and financial relationships with Western defense structures are often cited by analysts as part of the broader infrastructure that sustains power projection in the region. At the same time, critics argue that such entanglements make these states indirect stakeholders in any escalation involving Iran, even if their stated policy is one of stability and deterrence. The strategic argument then turns to the vulnerability of the Persian Gulf's energy infrastructure. The region's refineries, export terminals, petrochemical facilities, and liquefied natural gas plants are widely understood as central nodes in the global energy supply chain. In a severe conflict scenario, disruption to these systems could trigger significant shocks in global commodity markets. However, while some commentary frames this in catastrophic terms, suggesting prolonged global depression, mainstream economic assessments typically describe a spectrum of outcomes ranging from severe price volatility to regional recessionary pressures, depending on duration, scope, and international response. The difference between disruption and systemic collapse remains a matter of debate among economists and geopolitical analysts rather than an established forecast. Attention then shifts to maritime security, particularly the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most strategically important shipping lanes. Any escalation in tensions in this corridor would carry immediate implications for global oil transit and insurance costs. Analysts frequently note that even limited interference, such as increased naval activity, targeted seizures, or heightened risk perceptions, can significantly affect global markets without requiring full closure. However, claims of permanent or unilateral control over the Strait are generally understood in strategic studies as rhetorical or aspirational positions rather than settled geopolitical realities, given the presence of multiple regional and international naval forces operating in the area. The broader narrative also highlights the information dimension of modern conflict. Social media platforms, international news outlets, and state-aligned communication channels are increasingly viewed as active participants in shaping public perception during geopolitical crises. Accusations of censorship, algorithmic suppression, or narrative bias frequently emerge from all sides of such disputes. At the same time, platform companies and governments typically justify moderation actions on the basis of policy enforcement, security concerns, or misinformation control, making the information environment highly contested rather than uniformly controlled by any single actor. Finally, the argument expands into a critique of long-standing regional power structures, including U.S. foreign policy, Gulf state alignments, and shifting global economic partnerships involving China, Russia, and regional actors. Some analysts interpret current tensions as evidence of a gradual transition away from unipolar influence toward a more fragmented multipolar order in which states diversify alliances and reduce dependence on any single external power. Others caution that such transitions are uneven, reversible, and shaped as much by internal politics and economic constraints as by strategic realignment. In this broader interpretation, the central issue is not a single confrontation, but a complex and evolving system of interlocking pressures, military, economic, informational, and diplomatic, that shape how states behave under stress. The outcome of these dynamics remains uncertain, and while worst-case scenarios are often emphasized in polemical discourse, real-world outcomes tend to be shaped by negotiation, deterrence, and incremental escalation management rather than absolute collapse or total victory narratives.